Good morning, North America. Welcome to Church Talk TV. Lively talk about life, church, and church life. I'm your co-host, Dr. Bill Tenney-Britton, and I'm joined, as usual, by my co-host, Dr. Chris Tenney-Britton, and we're broadcasting from our studio in Columbia, Missouri, the heartland of America. Say good morning, Chris.
Well, good morning, good morning, good morning. No, Chris is not here this morning with Church Talk. She's out of town, but I've got a special guest, and we'll be talking with Paul Borden in just a moment. You know, over the years, the role of the lead pastor has changed pretty significantly. In the 1950s, church growth was pretty much biological. You know, you got the families in, and mom and dad had kids, and the kids were raised in the church, and they stayed in the church, and people didn't go. And the pastor's job was pretty much to do member care and to make sure that everyone had some programming, age-graded programming. So everything from nursery to seniors, there was something going on to hang on to them all. And that's how churches grew. But that stopped working as a church growth tool back in the late 1960s. About that time, we started to see a rise in social ministry and social justice projects that began to at least become an attempt to try and grow the churches. I'm not sure that it did a whole lot, but it was a good idea to begin with. And we still see vestiges about the social ministry, social justice, and the hope that membership care is going to grow the church. We still see those today. In 2012, Paul Borden wrote a book that looked at the role of the lead pastor, and Paul's joining me today. The book he wrote was How to Make or Break Your Church in 365 Days. I love the title. I love the book. Paul's the director of Wooddale Advance. It's a new ministry of Wooddale Church in Eden Prairie, Minnesota. It's designed to be a resource to congregations and to church leaders to help them grow. He's written 4 books, all related to congregational transformation: Hit the Bullseye, which was a hit, Direct Hit, Assault at the Gate, and Make or Break Your Church in 365 Days. He spends most of his time these days working with pastors and congregations doing coaching and consulting. And Paul, it is a joy to have you joining us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I appreciated your ministry over the years and the relationship we have had.
Well, thank you. Paul writes for Net Results virtually every issue. Okay, so let's jump into this, Paul. A lot has changed since you wrote Make or Break. What would you say is the most significant changes you've seen, especially in terms of the role of the lead pastor?
Well, obviously, the most significant change is what's been the result of the pandemic that has forced churches, congregations, even very small ones, to somehow enter into the digital world when it comes to how they broadcast their services, how they meet, how they interact with the community. I still find that a lot of churches that have been forced to do this aren't often overly happy about it, but at least they have kind of dipped their toe into this digital world, which is the world in which most of the people in our country, particularly 50 years of age and younger, live, and the church just has not had a major impact on this world. So how that impacts how they do worship, that's probably been the biggest change that I have seen. I think the second biggest change is the younger generations who have come along are really involved in causes, all different kinds of causes. And I'm finding that if churches today aren't serious about, say, what are some key causes, whether they're in our community, whether they're in our nation, or we're trying to deal with something that's worldwide, often they see the church as not being very relevant to other issues because they don't have these causes. And so from my perspective, those would be the 2 biggest changes I have seen since the book came out in 2012.
And so with that in mind, what do you think is the role today of the lead pastor in the causes and in the COVID and all that? It's got to be more than just preaching, I would think.
Oh, yes. In fact, I think because we have now moved away from a Christendom culture. I mean, in a sense, when you describe the church in the 60s, that was still reflecting churches that were designed to minister to a Christendom culture where the beliefs and the values of the Bible or the church were often the beliefs and the values of the culture. And because we no longer serve that culture, even in the Bible Belt where there's some vestiges left, we still don't see that culture. I think the rise of the lead pastor is to be much more of a missional leader. The metaphor I've been using lately is we've often heard of seen the church described as a cruise ship. And if that's the case, then the pastor is the captain who's to make sure that people are fed, that people have excursions, that people are happy. And the more rooms that are booked on each trip that goes out, the better the captain is perceived. I think they need to see the captain of the church or the pastor as the captain of a large Coast Guard ship that is designed to go out and to find people, rescue people, help people. They still want to feed the crew. They still want to train the crew. They still give the crew R&R. But all of that is done not for the sake of the crew. It's for the sake of the task, which is to go out and rescue people. And I think when churches begin to see themselves and the pastor in that kind of a metaphor, it changes the whole role of who the pastor is, whether she or he, whether they're preaching or whatever, they're to lead the church on mission to reach a world that really almost now sees the church as irrelevant totally.
One of the things that I found most surprising in your book was how much time the lead pastor of a growing church spent off the church campus. Now, of course, right now there's still this COVID divide of where the pastor can go and how safe it is in crowds. But let's fast forward 6 months or a year from now and presume this pandemic isn't going to be a permanent part of our culture. What would you share, or would you share what you found then, and whether your recommendation has changed in how much time the pastor should spend outside with those that we're, if you will, rescuing, those in the culture that are beyond the reach of the church?
Well, when I wrote the book, it was based on a lot of interviews that I did with pastors here in North America when I traveled to Australia and New Zealand. And the criteria for me to interview a pastor was that individual, when they had gone to the church, they were now pastoring, or when they had pastored prior to what they were doing at this point, the church had been either in plateau or decline. Most of them were relatively small, some as small as 50, some maybe at 200, but they were in plateau or decline, and they had seen significant transformation. Churches that were 50 were then 300, or churches of 200 that some were 1,000, some had even become mega churches. And I said to them, when you got to this church, there was no momentum, there was no zeal, as Paul talks about in Romans 12. What did you do to begin to turn things around? Now, it was interesting. There were only about 10 different things that all these pastors did. Now, they didn't do all 10, but did different ones of the 10. But 2 that all of them said they did. The first thing they said was, nobody was visiting our church. Our people were not inviting people to our church. And I saw my job as to be a person who modeled gathering sheep. And so I had to become a person out in the community, talking to people, inviting them to church, developing relationships with them, which meant I needed to be out of the office. In fact, often I was interviewing these pastors. We would be sitting in a restaurant, and sometimes I could hardly get through the interview because they were already inviting the wait person they were finding out things about that person, inviting them to church. And so they said, if we don't model, if we don't demonstrate that we are going to be out gathering sheep for the church, we cannot expect the congregation to do it. That doesn't happen if we're sitting in our office. And so they said that's one reason why we need to be out in the community. The second is related to this whole idea of causes. They began to realize that if I don't know the community, if I don't have an interest in the community, if I don't demonstrate that I want to be an integral part of the community, that that we're not going to be ministering to the causes. We're not going to know the needs. We're not going to know how we can serve the community. I did an interim last year in a suburban community. The church had been on decline for almost 2 decades. Pre-COVID, it was running about 170 in a worship service. And the new pastor who came this January, in 4 months, has already had 2 interactions with the mayors. With the mayor, he has visited a number of businesses. In fact, they had a whole monthly program where they encouraged people when they went into local businesses to say, "We are here to support you. We want to buy and help you or use the service you provide." And as a result, that church is already growing, even though they're still only meeting outdoors. Now, they are in a part of the country where they can do that. They're growing in their digital service because the people in the community are beginning to see that here's a church that not only says they care for us, but they are modeling it and becoming an integral part of the community. So I was surprised because when I talked to these pastors and interviewed them, most of them had gone through this time of transformation. And all of them said they probably spent between 40 to 50% of their time outside the church, not in the office, that they needed to be meeting with community leaders, with other parachurch organizations, with other pastors in other churches, meeting with people in schools. And as I've been working with many smaller congregations, one of the ways that we have helped them begin to get a jump start and gain some momentum is to connect with schools or to connect with special interests in the community and say, we want to be a part of that. How can we serve you? What can we do? And so the whole idea that the pastor is to sit in his or her office and have office hours and expect people to come in and talk to them, they would do these kinds of things, but they were much more focused on being out in the community as shall we say, the captains of the lifeguard ships.
So with the church have been out of the building for over a year for a lot of churches. As they're going back, we're seeing lots of decline from pre-COVID numbers, as much as 50%, sometimes more, very rarely much less. Given that, what advice would you give to pastors and churches for the next, 4 or 6 months to how to start recouping those losses?
Well, I would say the first thing the church needs to do is to realize that having a digital presence is not a part of the response to the pandemic. It is an initiative to touch the culture where it is. That the fact that in a short time, we may all be able to go back, be in the same building, feel safe. Many people aren't going to come back. But even if they all came back, we need to see that we still have another congregation. And that congregation is the congregation that probably won't come back or has never come in the first place. The one thing that the last year or so did with the digital services, it provided a glass wall, as it were, where people who normally didn't go to church could look and watch and see what happened and still had the freedom, if they wanted to walk out of the room, to go to something else on their device or whatever. And if we think that that's going to continue, I think those who have had the opportunity to see what happens in church and then say, do I want to come and be a part of that? That day is over. So that most of the people who are out there at this juncture aren't even going to be looking at our digital services, which means 2 things. Number one, we have to have a digital ministry that reaches the unchurched, the unbelievers who don't even look at church on their radar when it comes to the weekend. How do we reach them? And I find that at least many pastors I talk to who are involved in this are still wondering how to do that. But the other piece is to say, if we're just going to put a camera in the back and hope that when we all come back, people will watch our church service, and we will run the church service primarily for the people who are in the room. My response is that's almost like watching a high school play or a junior high school play. People aren't going to do that. And so the churches that I'm working with that are doing some significant things are realizing that on Sunday now, we will need to do an abbreviated form of what we're going to do in person that Sunday, so that people who travel, people who, for whatever reason, work and can't be there, will watch, but they're not going to watch that whole service. We need to do something that's abbreviated for them. But then we need to begin to wrestle with how do we design other venues that we use, not only to stream, whether it's on YouTube or whatever, but to network what we're doing with all the social media that's happening. And churches are realizing that just streaming without being connected to social media is not going to work. You've got to have that present, whether it's Instagram, even on Facebook or whatever it is. You've got to be doing that. And I think a lot of churches are going to be highly disappointed when they think, well, once we can all come back, everybody's going to come back. Well, they may for a month or so. But we've got to remember that the average worship attendance prior to the pandemic in most churches was somebody would come 1.5 Sundays a month and consider themselves a regular attender. And once the phenomenon of saying now we can meet together again, it's going to be a cavalier approach. And some who have found it's much more convenient to watch church when I want to do it in my pajamas, to do it with a coffee mug in my hand or whatever it is, which sometimes I can't even do in church. It's going to be easier. We're going to find that attendance is not going to, it's not going to come back like we want it to. And we have to realize that we do have an opportunity, even if we're a church of 50, to have a second congregation, which is a digital congregation, but we don't reach them the same way we're trying to reach the people who are showing up in person.
Wow, there's a lot there, and there's, of course, a lot more to say, but we're running out of time. We're going to have Paul back on a fairly regular basis. He's got more to share, and we're excited about the prospects of that. Paul, any last words do you want to share with us, with the audience?
Well, I'm just encouraged with what I am seeing God do among some established congregations that have been in plateau or decline. The transformation is a reality. It's not always easy, but it is a reality, and there is hope for even very small congregations.
Awesome. Thank you. Paul Borden, who is with the Wooddale Advance, and the URL, of course, is right there. You can reach him there. Paul, thanks for joining us. We'll see you soon, and we'll see you all next week.